Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so let's get started. We only have 3 class periods left, and what we're doing with this week is talking about how JavaScript essentially ties together the browser with the server. And that's what you're going to be doing on your final web project, is tying together the client and server side. So with JavaScript, we're going to be talking about how it can modify the DOM, how you can use it to deal with forms, and then how you can contact the server through AJAX requests. So that's today. Thursday, we're talking about the most established framework, jQuery, that is out there. Now, it is not the most, well, it may be the most widely used still because it may be used with certain less reactive websites. I think I saw that maybe used a great deal with WordPress. You have other tools like React, Vue, Angular, which are frameworks higher level that you often use in constructing websites. And the reason I don't talk about those frameworks is they constantly change, and new ones become popular and old ones fall away. When I did the project that you're working on, Angular was the most popular framework at the time. Now it's React. So if I taught you a framework, it would just be what I taught you in a few years would be obsolete. But the base level, this kind of assembly language programming I'm teaching you, it doesn't change much anymore. It's pretty well established, and you may sometimes have to use it even if you're using a framework. For example, when I was dealing with Angular and creating this A-Bit website, I needed to use a charting application that wasn't well integrated with Angular, and therefore I actually had to know how to use JavaScript and jQuery at the base levels in order to deal with that package. So you never know when you're going to have to deal kind of with the low-level plumbing, and that's why I teach it in this course and expect you to use it in the projects. So on Thursday, I'm going to go over the interactions again in the project and show you how the PHP scripts you wrote in Web Project 3, how you can use them in Web Project 4 to accomplish the various tasks that I want you to accomplish in Web Project 4. So that will be part of the lecture on Thursday. Today, we're finishing up how you modify the DOM using JavaScript, and then we're going into forms, events, and AJAX. Now, hopefully you remember that the first thing you do when, well, first of all, the browser creates this DOM object, document object model, which is an HTML tree. And, or the tree is, the interior nodes are HTML elements. The leaf nodes are either text content nodes or they're HTML elements that can't have any content in them, like say a horizontal rule or a break element. So you want to have ways of traversing this tree and accessing elements in the tree. And the way you can do that is with a number of functions, which I've shown here, but there's a couple more that I presented on Thursday that are in the book, specifically query select that allows you to select by CSS selector. And that's a very popular way to select elements as well. But each of these methods that you see here will return either a pointer to an element or an array of pointers to HTML elements. And then you can modify the style object in order to modify their appearance. And you can make a number of changes that, or invoke a number of editing commands that I'm going to show you in a moment that will allow you to modify the tree itself. And this document is a predefined variable provided by all browsers, points to that DOM object, the root of the DOM. Okay, so once you have your pointer to the appropriate DOM element, there's a number of ways you can modify the structure of the page. This one, the right, should only be used when you first load the page. It's very dangerous because it completely eliminates whatever content was there before and creates a completely new DOM object, which is typically not what you want. So you typically only see this when you're first loading a page, and I'm not going to dwell on it because I rarely use it. A second way to modify a subtree is with the inner HTML property. Anything that you give to the inner HTML, a string, you give it a string, and it's parsed into a tree, and it replaces whatever subtree is currently at that element. So this is a very powerful property because it obviates the necessity of creating a lot of the tree nodes yourself. Instead, you just provide a string that indicates what you want, and it will create the appropriate tree for you. So for example, if I were to say, inner HTML equals strong, hello, Brad, or just we'll say hello, then the browser would create a subtree with strong as the root element, and then it would have a text content node that would have the string hello associated with it, and it would replace whatever was there. So inner HTML is very powerful command. And then last time we also talked about, I believe it was the text content property that you could use to change also the content at a node. And as I posted on Piazza, that one will not parse the string. It will simply take what is ever in that string and literally output it on the page. So it's a way to avoid cross-scripting attacks, for example, because people can't embed HTML elements into a string assigned to the text content property and cause the DOM to change. So you can also change an attribute. You don't say dot attribute, you actually give the name of the attribute. So over here, you can see we get a element that's been named image, and we're changing its source attribute to be landscape.jpg, which would change the image that was being displayed. And then finally, you can change the style object. Every element has a style object. It's a CSS style object, and every attribute there corresponds to a property in CSS. So for example, if I wanted to change the color to blue of this paragraph, .style.color equals blue, and then here style.disabled equals false, it would, if this was a widget, it would disable the widget so you couldn't deal with it. So these commands kind of deal, well, they don't necessarily deal with leaves because this one could be anywhere in the document, but often they appear at leaves. Now, you sometimes need to be able to actually create new HTML elements. And the way you do that is with the create element command. You give it the tag name that you want. It creates a node of that type and returns a pointer to it. So I've assigned that to the variable new paragraph here. Now, that does not insert this new element into the DOM. You have to tell the DOM where you want it to appear in the tree. So after you create an element and you've presumably created some content, there's a number of things you can do to put it into the tree. So remember, the tree, you have a tree and it has some number of children. So one thing you can do is append the child to the end. So you can just append the new node out here. That would be one thing you could do with append child. And you need to have the parent node in order to do that. Or if it's any other node, then you can grab the appropriate target, whatever sibling node you want. These would all be sibling nodes, and insert before them. So basically, if you want to append to the end, you use append. If you want to otherwise insert before any other of the sibling nodes, you get a pointer to that sibling node and you say parent.insert before the new element, and the target is a pointer to one of those siblings. And then the third possibility is you simply want to replace one of these siblings. So if you wanted, for example, to replace that one, you would simply say replace child, giving it the new child element and a pointer to this old child element. And finally, sometimes you just want to delete something, which will happen in your project when you need to delete a plan using the trash can. And in that case, remove child will remove the element from the DOM tree. So this could potentially be the way you delete, one way to delete a plan in the assessment section. Now, there's probably a better way to do it using probably a delete row command, but this is certainly one way you could do it. Okay, so those are the basic commands you have that will allow you to modify the DOM. And once you have this tag, you could, example, say dot text content to add new content to it, or you could add attributes to it. So there are all kinds of things you can do to flesh out this element once you have it. Okay, and then you may also need to be able to navigate the DOM. So once you have a pointer to an object, there's a whole bunch of ways you can, if it's in the DOM, that you can get around. So parent node property points to the parent, then child nodes is effectively an array of all your children. You can get your first child and your last child. You can get your next sibling and previous sibling. So this is really handy. All kinds of properties that allow you to easily get around that tree. If you want to get to the body element, which is kind of the root of the body of the document, then document.body does that. And document.document element gives you access to the root of the entire document, which would include the head element. Okay, so a couple of examples to show you how you might do things. So we have a div with two paragraphs. This is a paragraph and this is another paragraph. So we're just going to take and copy this into a file. And when we display it, you can see just a couple of paragraphs. Okay, now what we want to do is add a new element at the end of the div, so after this paragraph. So what we're going to do is create an element P, set its inner HTML to this is new. Then we need to add it to the tree. We do that by getting ID of div1 right there. And we call its append child method with this new element. So that we could have a script for doing that. And you're going to see it's not going to work out too well. I don't think it's going to work out. So we'll try it. And nothing happened. Okay, so the problem is that, well, actually one problem is I have two script things. So let's, before I make any pronouncements that I understood what the problem was. Okay, still doesn't work. So at this point, when head is loaded, the DOM has not yet been created. So the script is actually operating on stuff that doesn't exist. And in fact, I think if I go and look at the tools, I will find perhaps well, it says unexpected caught syntax there, unexpected token, and I can learn more. But I think that the problem is that the script is executing before the DOM finishes. So what I am going to instead see if I can't do is put this into,
I think the var on the second line is messing things up. Your var paragraph in your HTML.
pardon?
That var needs to go away.
Ah, you're right. Okay, so maybe, thank you. Type error element is null. Okay, so I think this is more like what I was expecting. Element is null at line 7. And I believe that's because this, the document object model is not yet constructed. So normally you want some stuff done, but after the document object model has been constructed. So one thing that you can do is set the on load. And so the load event, which we'll get to, doesn't get executed until the DOM has been created. So here we're going to create an anonymous function to do this. This still might not work because the DOM has not yet been set up at this point either. In fact, we are still getting document.body is null. So we'll now try to grins. The script down here. And it worked because now the DOM had been created. Okay, so you have to be a bit careful that you don't start doing things with the DOM before the DOM has been created. And one way that you can defer any action is by assigning a function to this load event for the body. And it won't execute until the DOM object has been created. In fact, that's what triggers the load event. Okay, so you see that it did work, and now it created this is new and added it to the end of our script. So now we're going to add another element before it. So instead of putting this is new at the end, we're going to put it before paragraph 1. So now we get the sibling pointer by asking for P1, and then we're going to insert it before that sibling. So we're going to take this code and put it here, replace the append child. So we got the document, created it, element. Okay, we don't need that. Okay, I think this should work. And indeed it did. So now, whoops. Wow, I just learned something. Somehow I managed to zoom without meaning to. Okay, so it went before it. And you can do similar things. I'm not going to, because I need to move on, with replacing a element. And as I said, I could completely replace the element of div1. So actually this one is worth doing. So this is where we're replacing completely the contents of div with new stuff. So as you can see, it completely erased the content. Okay, so what I do want to show you is how you can create a new table. So let's do that next. Okay, let's go to JavaScript. Okay, so let me show you what's going on first, and then we'll walk through the code. So in your assessment plan section, you're going to have the ability to add a new plan to your assessment section. And I used a table. You might use something else, but I want to show you how you could add a row to a table. So here I press the button add row. You see a new row has appeared, which is along the lines of what you want to be able to do in your web project. So how did I make that happen? So you can see I created a table, named it name table, and that was the table you saw. Created a button, on click equals handle click. So whoops, our script. Uh-oh. Huh. Something I did closed off Emacs. Okay. Okay, so you can see the table. I had some style information, but the big thing is this handle click function. So I wanted to create a new row content, and you can see here I create an HTML string with what I wanted that row content to be: a row with a cell containing Brad, a cell containing Vanderzanden, and a cell containing Knoxville, Tennessee. And I had all the HTML I needed to set up that row and that string. Then I got a table reference by saying get element by ID name table, because down here that's its name. And then I got the table body. So every table has a table body, and you'll notice I got it by tag name. So that gave me an array, because tag name always gives you an array. So even though there's only one table body tag, I still have to refer to it using indexing. So that's index 0. So that gives me a reference actually to the table body. And table body has a method called insert row that will insert a row at the very end. And it returns that HTML element. So I get, after I say insert row, I get a new DOM element. It's inserted already, but it's currently an empty row. And then I set that new rows.html equal to the content of this string. And you saw that it worked. I got a new row in my table. So I suggest, actually, I'll post this to Piazza because it's not yet in my notes. I suggest you at least take a look at this. You can also do it with jQuery, and probably do it even easier than this with jQuery, but this is how you can do it just using native JavaScript. So any questions?
We're not allowed to use Jake.
Pardon?
I was just going to say, we're not allowed to use jQuery, are we?
No, you're allowed to use jQuery. I guess I shouldn't have. I thought in the assignment I said you were allowed to use jQuery, just no other framework. You can use jQuery. So if I'll check yes, you are allowed to use jQuery. jQuery is so fundamental that it's how to put it. So jQuery was kind of framework 1.0, and it is so stable at this point that I consider it to be hand in glove with JavaScript. Everything else seems to change, jQuery doesn't. So I'm happy if you use jQuery on your project.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions about any of these modification commands or these find commands that I've gone over? Okay. In that case, I have some PowerPoint slides for the next part because it makes it a little easier to go through them. So, as I said, we now know how to modify the document object model, but in order to modify it, we have to be kicked into action somehow. So the way that we get kicked into action is via events. So events are things like mouse events, mouse clicks, mouse moves, mouse presses, a keyboard event like a key press. It could be a network response from the web server. There's events that the web browser responds to. And we call it event-driven programming because the code runs only in response to events. So the only way JavaScript can modify the DOM is if the user or the server interacts in some way with the browser and generates an event. And we are able to attach event handlers to the various events so that when the event occurs, that event handler is called. And sometimes you hear these event handlers called callback procedures. Sometimes you hear them referred to as event listeners. They're all synonyms for a function that runs in response to an event and performs some activity. And the occurrence and timing of events is unpredictable, so you can't impose typically an order in which the events will execute. So you have to write your callback procedures in a way that they can operate independently of each other. You can't really assume when you write callback procedure B that it will execute only after callback procedure A has executed. That's generally not in the spirit of event programming. So HTML and therefore JavaScript gives you a number of common events. And this isn't the only events, but it is the most common event. So the change event is generated by radial buttons, checkboxes, I believe the select tag drop-down menu. An input event is triggered by buttons and by text boxes and text areas. The load event, as I already told you, it depends, is caused when the browser has completed loading a resource. So for example, with the body tag, the load event is triggered when the DOM object has been created. We'll see with AJAX objects, the load event is triggered when a response has been received from the server. So the load event will be important because the server means that the server has responded to an AJAX event. This one I use, I'm not sure I've ever used this one. So it's caused when an HTML file has been loaded and parsed, meaning that the DOM model is there, but other resources such as CSS, JavaScript, and image files may not yet be loaded. So it allows you to get a preview of what the DOM object will look like, but you can't assume everything has been defined in it yet. So that's why I'm always leery to use this particular event. I generally use the load event instead. The focus event is generated when an object becomes active and gains the focus of either the mouse or the keyboard. So when I click on an input box, it often gets highlighted to indicate that it's active and it generates a focus event. Conversely, when it loses the focus, then the element will generate a blur event. And then submit events occur when the user submits a form to the web server. And a common error made with the submit event is to associate it with the submit button. It actually has to be associated with the form element. You try to attach a event handler to the submit event of a button, it doesn't seem to work. So these are the most common events that you want to attach event handlers to. So the next thing is, how do we associate callback procedures with an event? And there are three ways you can do it in JavaScript. The preferred way is with the add event listener method, and you attach that to the object, the HTML DOM object that you expect to generate the event. So here I have an input object that points to some arbitrary, probably a text box, and I'm adding an event listener for the focus. So you can see the event name is in quotes, and then an anonymous function that in this case sets the border to green, and one that when it loses the focus, the blur event, it changes the border to blue. And the advantage of the add event listener is that you can add multiple callback functions to the same event. So sometimes you want to be able to do that. Two different activities are associated with the same event on that object. But there are two other ways to do it. So you can simply prefix the name of the event with on. So on click equals and the name of a function. So here we got using the CSS selector for an ID attribute. We got my button, and we said its on click method to be equal to click handler. Now this will replace whatever used to be there. So that's why it's a little less robust than add event listener, because it tramples whatever used to be handling this click event.
In the in the event listener, does it go through, I guess, the array of callbacks in order from top to bottom?
Good question. I would imagine that's how it does it, but I'm not 100% sure. It doesn't seem like anything else would make sense other than to go through it in the order in which they were added. But I've seen things that don't make sense in the past.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right.
Okay. So, and then the third way, you can put it in the markup itself. And this is generally frowned upon because normally the idea is that the markup should only contain content that is being displayed, and you should move the actions associated with the context into the JavaScript file itself. So normally I'd rather you not do it this way. And again, the event name is prefixed with on. Now, so those are the three ways. I'm not going to penalize you for using any of these three ways, but again, I prefer in general that you use either add event listener or this on click method, not on click method, but these properties that in the DOM itself. And then with the callback function, it can take, actually, you can pass in here an event, a predefined variable called event. And then the event itself doesn't tend to be of much use with the properties simply because the names of the properties often vary from browser to browser, but it does have a couple methods associated with it. The one I find to be very helpful is prevent default. And it stops the default browser behavior from occurring. And you'll see me give an example of that later. But one place where it's really helpful is that the submit event for a browser by default resets the form widgets to their default factory settings. And often that's not what you want. For any of you who've gone through a massive form and entered your credit card number and your address and made a mistake, and then the form comes back and it's empty and you're ticked off, it's because the writer of the script failed to use the prevent default method and allowed the browser to wipe out everything by reverting the form to its default values. So that is one important use of the event object. And then every function has a this pointer implicitly defined that allows that, and that this pointer points to the HTML element on which the event occurred. So that is very helpful as well. And you're allowed to pass other, you can specify in here what things you are passing to the function, but normally other than event, I don't find a lot of other things always to be that helpful, but sometimes there are things I guess you want to pass, maybe a property that you want to change, make visible or invisible, but normally you could get access to that through the HTML element. Okay, so those are events, pretty simple. You have these event names, so you can either do add event listener and put these in quotes, or you can put an on in front of them, on input, on load, on DOM content loaded, etc., and associate an event handler that way. Okay. Now, the next thing you might want to do is set something to happen in the future. So when an event occurs, you might want to cause the browser to do something after a time delay of some milliseconds. So there is a function that you don't have to put, it's just defined by JavaScript. So this is a JavaScript function, takes an anonymous function or a function name, and the time in milliseconds from now when you want that function to execute. And in that amount of time, it will execute. So that's how you can set up an animation or a timer or something to periodically update a web page with things like counts in an election or stock quotes or scores. Any of those things that you want periodically refreshed, you could do that with this set timeout. And then it returns a unique integer identifier so that if you want to, for some reason, kill the timeout before it is executed, you can call clear timeout with that identifier. Okay, so here's an example where, remember, in your project, you'll have to print or make visible for a short period of time a message after you try to save a result or an assessment or a narrative to indicate whether the save succeeded or failed. And after a period of time, like say 3 seconds, you'll want that message to disappear. So here's an example of doing that. So before I do it, I'll show you what happens. Let's see, where's my save one? Show message.html. Okay, so when I click Save Changes here, items were saved, and then 3 seconds later it disappears. Okay, so I want something like that in your web project. So you can see here I have my button, Save Changes, and I have, in this case, I created a span. The ID save message, class equals save message style, items were saved. But it didn't show up initially, because if you look up here at save message style, you see that its visibility is hidden. That means that when the page is loaded, it's in the DOM, but it's not visible. You see I set the color to blue and had 2 font families. That was a mistake. In fact, why it was showing up as, should have been showing up that way rather than with Times New Roman. So then you'll notice here, save button, I passed in the event. And you'll notice that the first thing I did was I called prevent default to stop the browser from doing the default thing, which I'll show you in a moment is not what I want. So then I let save message equal, I get a reference to the save message element, and I set via the style object its visibility property to visible. And then because I want it to disappear in 3 seconds, I call a timeout, and the function I pass is simply one that gets the save message element and sets the visibility back to hidden. And I indicate that that should be done 3,000 milliseconds from now. Okay, so simple enough. Now, just watch what happens if I take out event.prevent default. Nothing. Let's do it again. Nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. So I'm not sure exactly what the browser's default behavior is, but I know whatever the default behavior is from the browser, it is messing me up. So I had to call event.prevent default to stop the browser from doing whatever it thought it was doing. Okay, so if you are not getting a behavior you expect when you select a button, especially when it's inside a form, a good idea is to call prevent default to see if that solves your problem. Okay, questions about that? Okay, moving on. So modifying the cascading style sheet. So you've already seen how you can do it using the style object. And one thing I had not mentioned, but it's important, in CSS, there are some properties like background color that have a dash between background and color, and those become camel case in JavaScript. You're not sure what camel case means. It means that new words start with a capital letter. So background, background color is the name of the property in CSS. Then the JavaScript name for that property is going to be background color with a capital C and no dash and no space. So that's camel case. Okay, each new word starts with a capital letter. Now, the other way to do things is to modify the class list property assigned to a node. So for example, I have div class equals account space warning, and it will have a list or array associated with it with the two items account and warning. And you can use classes to style your objects. So by adding or removing classes, you can modify the style assigned to an object. So the class list property has 4 methods associated with it. You can add a class to the property, remove a class using just the string name, toggle, which will, if you give it the name of a class, if the class is in the list, it will remove it. And if it is not in the list, it will add it. And then contains will return true or false, depending on whether the class name is there. Now, you don't normally need to use contains because add will not add the class a second time. So if it's already there, add doesn't add it a second time. Same thing, if you call remove and the class is not there, nothing bad happens. So you really don't need to call the contains method before an add or remove. Okay, so we now have an example with validating a phone number. So let's go to phone number first. And certainly not save message. Huh. Rep phone start at HTML. There we go. Is that the one I want though? Yes, I think it is. Let me make sure. Yes, it is. Okay. So we'll do phone.html. Okay, we have a phone number. And when I enter a valid one, it pops up a dialog box. But when I try to enter an invalid one, it changes the lettering to red and it creates a yellow background, and it increases the size of the font. Okay, and then when I correct it, it changes it back. So the way I did it was actually by, initially, I did it in this way. I actually created a regular expression and I tested the value to see if it was true or false. If it met the test, you can see I changed the color, background color, and font size. Otherwise, if it was an error, I changed the color to red, the background color to yellow, the font size to larger. I also, this title attribute appears when a string appears when you hover over something. So here I set it to null, but if it's an error, I say phone number should be XXX-XXX-XXX. And you'll notice that when I hover, it doesn't appear that easily, but you see phone number should be, and it shows the pattern that I want. So that's always good for feedback purposes. When an error has occurred, it's nice if they hover, either something pops up to show what they want, or you print a little message showing what they want. Okay, but this isn't the best way, in my opinion, to do it, because you're kind of having to put 3 statements in here, and you're always having to make sure that they execute. So what I prefer is the way I show it here. So I have a style for a phone error where I set the font size to 150%, the color to red, and the background color to yellow. And now you can see that input type equals text, name equals phone. On change, I end up calling validate phone number. And you can see that now what I do is if the test succeeds, I simply remove phone error. Notice I don't do a test to see whether it's already there, and set the title to empty. Otherwise, I simply add phone error and set phone number to, or the title to be a little string saying what I want. So it makes the JavaScript code simpler. And it, by just going and looking at the style, there's kind of, they're all together in one place. I can see what the style should be when an error occurs. Also, I didn't have to put statements in here that reverted the style back to the original style. I didn't have to remember what the original style was. Instead, I simply add a new style that overrides the original settings, and then I remove a style. So again, I don't care which way you do it in your assignment. I prefer this way, where you add a class to change the style and delete a class, because as you see here, it led to less code. You don't have to remember the original settings. You just, in effect, toggle between 2 different classes. And you can, in the style sheet, in one place, you put all the rules for that particular style. So I prefer this way, but if you want to do it the other way, where you just change the style object, that's fine.
Just out of curiosity, is there any like, you know, the wrong browser or something like that that would cause that class list to not be overwritten like that, or is that guaranteed no matter what browser?
I think
No
it's
matter what.
guaranteed whatever browser you use, unless you have a circa 2012 computer that is running Internet Explorer, and then I think all bets are off. So I think basically, I think if you're using any browser released in the last 5 or 6 years, it's defined for it. But it's a good question. I actually did not, I only recently learned about class lists myself, so I am not 100% sure when it was added to the standard. Does anyone know?
It's somewhat new, but you're right about browsers supporting it. I know Internet Explorer has some edge cases where they don't support like some of the more advanced usages of it, but what you displayed should work in all browsers.
Okay, thank you. And certainly I expect that it will work in the TA's browser when they try to do it, check your project. Okay, so moving on, form validation. So I love regular expressions. I think that they work really well for checking input. In addition, HTML5 introduced some useful attributes. So you have to do some extra work when you use regular expressions where you create the regular expression, then you call test. So HTML5 said, hey, let's make it a little simpler. And you can actually specify that regular expression in a pattern, which I'll show you in a moment. So you can use the pattern attribute to specify a regular expression. You can use min and max with number widgets to specify minimum and maximum values. Let's see here. You can use max length and minimum length to indicate the maximum and minimum length of input allowed by an input field. And in your web project, I told you that passwords are limited to a maximum of 20 characters. So max length is going to work there. I also told you that there are certain limitations on the length of a narrative, strengths, weaknesses, and recommended action. So again, by putting in max length and min length, you can automatically prevent the user from submitting a string that is too short or too long. You've seen this title attribute already. It can be used to provide either a description of valid input, or if it's invalid, why it's invalid. And then the required attribute you can use to indicate to the browser that that field must have a value prior to submitting the form. And again, I told you in the project write-out that certain fields are required in the ABET form when they're submitted. So you can put a required attribute there, and the browser should, at least modern browsers should, automatically detect if you have not provided that attribute and pop up a little message saying, in that box, saying you need to provide a value for it. And then the browser has effectively will set a valid field to indicate, as the person is entering input, if the current input is valid or not. So if they're typing in a text string, as they add each character, that field gets reset depending on whether the current input is valid or invalid. And then CSS provides some what are called pseudo-class selectors, :valid and :invalid, that you can use to style valid and invalid input widgets. Okay, and you can also do that with required and optional. So depending on whether the required keyword is there or not, if it's there, this selector would be in effect. If it's required is absent, this selector would be in effect. So you can actually indicate to a user, I'm sure you've seen forms where there's some visual cue that indicates that certain form elements are required and certain other ones are optional, and that they're basically styling them using these two pseudo classes. Okay, so let's show you another example where we put a 2-pixel red border around invalid text input. So let's again, I think this one, do my grep again. Okay, that's in forms.html. Okay, so let's make this a little bigger. Okay, so this one is supposed to, I think, be a, needs to be a capital letter and a 6. So you'll notice that this is not valid because it doesn't yet have a capital letter and a 6. So when I come out, it's shown as invalid. Okay, this one, it shows the pattern I want. I'm going to ignore it. And it doesn't like it. So I can go back and fix it. And now it's happy. As it goes back to the normal style, same thing. I'll change this to a 6, goes back to a normal style. Okay, you'll notice when I tried to submit this query, please match the requested format. So the browser did automatically without me doing anything. So it wouldn't let me submit invalid input.
Is that was that using the, sorry, what is it called, the pattern?
Yes.
And
So
the
I'm going
title.
to, yes, so I'm going to show you that in a moment. In fact, one more thing, I'm going to make date required. So I'm going to fix this. And notice now it highlighted date because I had not provided a date for it when I submit it. You'll notice irritatingly, it also eliminated, it went back to default settings for the other things. So that again is where you have to use event.prevent default to stop the browser from reverting everything back to what you don't want. Okay. So here, the question was, did I use the pattern attribute? And the answer is yes. So you can see I required that the first letter be a capital A, B, or C, and the second character be a digit between 0 and 9. And then here, I required that the pattern be a 3-digit number in parentheses, and I had to escape the parentheses because otherwise it would think it was trying to do
Capture.
Capture, thank you. And interesting, and I put the caret here and the $sign here, so I'm actually wondering here if I can say Brad B6 X5, and the answer is no. So it looks like I actually don't need to have this caret and $sign there because this one type checked perfectly well without that pattern. Okay, notice here I put required for date. That was what was causing the date to be highlighted. And then up here, you can see that I used the selector :invalid for input. So any type that is input, I said that if it is invalid, I want its border to be 2 pixels red and solid. That is how I managed to get any invalid input item put in red. You'll also notice that this right here, this is another annoying thing about browsers. So key code 13 is the enter key or return key. And people have a nasty habit of hitting that enter or return key when they're done with a text box. Okay, so B6 and they hit return. And you generally don't want anything to happen when they do that. And so if the key code is not equal to 13, I'm happy to return it to the browser. Otherwise, what I'm doing is I'm eating the key code. So that's what's happening there, is I'm eating any enter event. And the reason I need to do that is because browsers, I'll get rid of this for a moment. Otherwise, what browsers like to do is call the submit event prematurely. So I enter, actually, let's enter a date here. And we enter B6. And I accidentally hit return. And it should have some, oh, wait, let's. Oh, wait. Okay, so there, when I hit, no, B6. Okay, now when I hit enter, I don't know what's going on. I'll be honest. I know that a lot of the time when you don't have that on key down, what happens is it submits the form prematurely. Right now, it's not doing that to me, but last night when I was testing it, it was. And unfortunately, that is a common behavior with input boxes, is if you hit the return or enter key, it prematurely submits the form. The way to avoid that in your projects, this is one way to do it. You can go to Stack Overflow and find, it seems like a dozen different ways to stop the enter key from submitting a form prematurely. I like this one because it was pretty concise. jQuery, I'll show you a better solution in jQuery. So at any rate, just recapping here. So regular expressions work very well for checking input, and an HTML5 pattern does it. Min and max for the widgets are very helpful. Required is very helpful for ensuring that getting the browser to actually enforce that all form elements that are required have a piece of input before the form gets submitted to the server. And you have these handy valid, invalid, and required optional pseudo class selectors that you can use for styling your widgets so that people can see if they have given valid or invalid input, or whether they have filled out all the required widgets. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time left, and I'm not going to get all the way through Ajax today, but we'll just at least introduce it. So we've talked about how the JavaScript is able to change the DOM and how we can associate those DOM changing functions with events. So the next thing we want to be able to do is to send requests to the server. And the way we do that is with something that colloquially is known as AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript XML maybe. And formally, the class that creates it is called XML HTTP request object, because when it was first invented, XML was the way that the encoding that was typically used for sending data to and from the server. These days, it's more frequently JSON that is the encoding method. So if you want to create a server request, you typically create a new XML HTTP request object. And what that will do is allow you to send to package up some parameters. So here we're packaging up some parameters with key value pairs, query, John, and type image, and the script that is being executed on the server side will be server.php. Then the server side script will execute, print out some result, plain text, maybe JSON, maybe XML, and send it back to the client. The client will get the response back in one of 3 fields. If it's JSON, it'll probably be a JSON object in the response field. If it's an XML object, it will be in the response XML field. If it's a plain text, it will be in the response text field. And you can tell the browser what type you are expecting the response to be by setting it to the appropriate string. So if you think it's going to come back as a JSON object, you can set the response type to JSON. So in your third project assignment, you'll note that you were using JSON encode to output your results from the JSON script. And the reason you were using JSON encode was so that it would come back as a JSON object into the response field of the AJAX request objects you'll be creating. Last thing I'll say today about it in my quick introduction is that AJAX is an asynchronous request. So it fires off a request to the browser to the server, but then you can continue to interact with the browser while the server is munching on that request. And when the server is done, it will send back the response, and at some point the browser will process that response with a callback function that updates the DOM, and the page will be updated. In contrast, when you do something like press a link, that issues a synchronous request to the server, and the browser freezes until that request is satisfied. In this case, a new page is loaded. And during that time, you can't interact with the web page. You can, of course, cancel the load, but you can't interact with the web page. So that is called a synchronous request, because while the request is being processed, you can't interact with the browser content. Whereas with an asynchronous request, the user continues to be able to interact with the browser page. And in fact, you could send off additional requests while the original request is still being acted on. And the user during this entire time continues to be able to interact with the browser, hence the term asynchronous request. Okay, so Thursday, we will talk more about AJAX, give you an example, and then go into jQuery and show you a few tricks that you can use with jQuery. So I will let you go. I'm free for the next maybe 15 minutes or so to take questions. And also,